Hello and welcome back to the studio. Well, as you can see, a blank canvas and another new project for this week. And it's a rather exciting project. It's working from photographs. Now this is something I've been asked to paint in the past. People have said, I've got a great photograph of, I don't know, somewhere I've been on a holiday maybe, and I want to make it into a painting, but I don't know where to start. So I thought, well, let's have a go. I've got some photographs that I took many moons ago. They're not the greatest of quality, but the composition's quite nice, I think. So let's see what we can do. So here's my canvas, 16 by 20 as usual. I'll be using two Bob Ross 1-inch brushes for this, an old one and a newer one for blending work. And this variety of brushes, liners, fans, filberts and this old 3/4 inch brush. I may or may not need that. I'll also be using a couple of small round detail brushes. These aren't Bob Ross but incredibly useful for this style of painting. And of course, a Bob Ross palette knife. To get started, I'm using just three colours, white, Prussian blue and some Van Dyke brown. I'm going to mix the blue and the brown together to make a lovely warm grey tone. This particular painting starts out with an underpainting of grey, commonly known as a grisaille painting. I think that's how you pronounce it. It is an underpainting sketch in grey. I've taken a little white to blend into my colour. I have a small dish of odorless thinners, and using that small round brush I want to make a very thin sketching wash of colour. This is tricky to show you, it's running down my palette before I can use it, but you can see it's very thin. Now I want to find the centre of my canvas. You'll see from my reference photograph that I divided it into 4 sections, and in each section I'm going to sketch in part of the reference photograph. Working from a black and white photograph means I'm not distracted by colour, and dividing my painting into quarters helps me position things more accurately. But this is an inspiration, not an exact detailed reproduction of the photograph. I rarely do exact versions of anything. I like to use some imagination. Here you see me using the corner of a baby wipe. Just dipped in some of that light grey paint, and I use this to create a mass or a shape of an item so I get an idea of scale. It's a very useful technique and one you should practice often. So we're off to a flying start with this painting, but there are a couple of little problems which I should explain. The first one is really more about sort of the layout. It's to do with proportions, and this is a little problem that sometimes we bump into occasionally, but we don't really know what happened or what went wrong. The problem is that this is a lovely wide photograph, but my canvas isn't wide. It's almost square. It's a 16 by 20, and this will probably suit, well, maybe an 18 by 24, something a bit more sort of lengthy and oblong. And trying to get all these elements to fit properly onto the canvas, well, it just didn't work, did it? Look at this gate, it's nice and long. It takes up probably a good chunk of this quarter. Well, I basically had to squash my gate down and to get that little bit of dry stone wall in there, so that's a problem. The other challenge I've got is that really the composition doesn't quite work. This tree, because the problems with the ratio of the size of the canvas, meant that to get this tree into the picture I had to shift it more towards the centre. The problem then, it sort of starts to cut my painting in half. So trying to compensate for the layout and the size of my canvas has led me into a few problems. The other challenge is where am I looking? I don't know if I'm supposed to look over there or if I'm supposed to look over there. I just get this blocking my view all the time. So let's shift things a bit. Let's move this tree over to the left and change the proportions here completely. And go back to our reference photograph and see if we can't sort out this ratio of 16 by 20, which would fit this canvas. One of the beauties of painting with a light grey colour in oils is that with a little bit of odorless thinners on a baby wipe, you can rub it out and start again. Here you'll see I've changed the layout of my painting. I'll explain this in a bit more detail in a moment. But suffice to say, I changed the proportions of my reference picture to one that suits the shape of my canvas. Again, I start off by dividing my painting into 4. You'll notice the gate on the left disappeared and I've moved my tree over. This opens up the view to the distance and I think a better composition. The thin grey colour I'm using to sketch dries very quickly, and if you need to make adjustments, just remember a baby wipe, a little drop of odourless thinners and you can rub it out. So here's my reworked canvas, and I think you'll agree this composition maybe looks a little bit better than the previous version. I've got a nice dark mass here and a nice dark mass here down in the corner. I left the tree out for the time being and it might make an appearance in the finished painting, but the proportions work better and it suits better. Now, the way I got this proportion to fit my canvas was very simple, very low tech. I happen to know that an A4 sheet of paper is about 16 centimetres, so as long as it fits on this way, I can measure 20 centimetres that way. I'll end up with a canvas size 16 inches by 20 inches or 16 centimetres by 20 centimetres. I've let this dry and now it's time to move on with the actual painting part of it. Time to add colour. I start off with some Bob Ross liquid white and an old 1-inch Bob Ross landscape brush. I'm going to bring the liquid white down to, well, probably the distant horizon line first. I apply a thin, even coat and watch this. You can work straight over the grey underpainting, but because we're applying it thinly, you can still see the sketch underneath. Magic. There we are. So all that work is still visible, just make sure that the grey underpainting has dried completely. I want a nice blue sky for my painting, so a tiny bit of Prussian blue on that 1-inch brush. Start in the corners. The top of the sky wants to be slightly darker than the horizon line, and I sort of want to work in a bit of a diagonal streak across my sky. There'll be no big clouds in this painting. There's lots of other detail to look at, and the sky is really, well, just the supporting cast. Now, I've used some of my grey colour, to which I'm adding a tiny bit of sap green. This is for my distant hills. Things far away in my painting want to be indistinct, pale, with no detail. I'm going to use a filbert brush for this, and I just want to scrub on a little colour in the background. You'll notice I let the blue colour go over the background hills. It creates that misty blue-grey layer that I'm looking for. Here's a close-up. It's just a case of scrubbing in some colour, letting it mix with the blue and the liquid white, and maybe keeping it a little lighter here, just above those fence posts. I've added a little yellow ochre to the side of this colour and worked it in. I want to sort of create the illusion of a distant cornfield maybe. I dry cleaned my filbert brush, I didn't bother washing it. I'll bring this colour in just underneath that first layer. I check my colour first. That's about right. And again, just scrub in this detail, but keep it faint and let it blend a little at the edges. Depth and distance is created by the lack of detail and colour. You'll notice this when you look into the distance of any scene. Now, I want to add a little more detail here, so I'm darkening up my green colour on that same brush and just dabbing in a hint of a tree or a bush, dividing up those two distant fields. As I work from the background to the midground, I use a little more sap green and a little bit more of my grey colour to darken my mixture. This little tree even gets a touch of highlight on it. Notice how distant those background hills now look. Just a little touch of colour here. That's all that I need. Now, back to the liquid white and that 3/4 inch brush came in useful here. Again, scrub it over the grey underpainting very, very thinly. Now, I'm using my nice 1-inch brush for this. I want some soft cornfield colours, so I'm using yellow ochre and a hint of white on a clean brush. I want this colour to be quite sharp and bright. This little field is just the other side of my gate, so I start off by dabbing on a little colour, standing back and checking to make sure it's right. You'll notice again the paint's quite thinly applied, and I can still just about see my gateway through this layer of paint. I tap between the trees and the edge of the cornfield and allow some of the colour to mix in for a shadow. I pick up a little sap green and add it to the edge of my cornfield just beyond the gate. Now I feel a choice to be made: palette knife or round brush for my gate. I don't know. I think maybe a mixture of the two, but I'm going to start off by mixing some Van Dyke brown and black. I want a very, very dark chocolate brown colour for my gate. Mix it up well. Then, using the edge of the palette knife, pick up a tiny roll of colour. When painting straight, thin objects like gates, I find palette knives work best. Press the knife firmly and just allow it to slide along. It gives you quite an accurate line. There we go. Drop in the rest of the bars. You'll see in a minute, I actually use another piece of equipment which I've not featured before, but I'll explain later. Having put the colour down in the right places, I now use a small round brush just to sort of fatten things up and tidy things up a little bit more. Again, I use my little pinky finger to act like a tripod. I actually rest my finger on the canvas. It steadies my hand. It's another clue as to what I'm going to be using in a moment. Now, let's mix up a new colour. Sap green, some black, and some Prussian blue. I want a really deep green colour for the tree on the left-hand side of the gate. There, it's got a bluish hint to it as well. I've picked up my blue sky brush and just press it into that dark green colour. Notice how I really open the bristles up. This is essential for the Bob Ross technique to work correctly. Now, let's mass in this tree, rounded side to the top. Notice how I push and press, but I don't let the brush skid. I want to lay down some texture. Remember, a thin highlight will stick to a dark, thick underpainting. That's what Bob taught us, and that technique works perfectly here. I'm using my nice soft new brush for the highlights. I press my brush into a little cadmium yellow, a little sap green. And remember, this is soft, oily paint, so you don't need to press very hard. Just a light touch, and it will stick to that thick, dark green underpainting. I paint one little part of my tree at a time, saving some shadows here and there. I'll add some more highlight to this layer later. Now, I've added a little more black to my Van Dyke brown. There's a lovely dry stone wall just to the left and right of the gate. I'm using a thin layer of dark colour, Van Dyke brown and black, to underpaint where the dry stone wall will be. This is a thin dark layer, so scrape off the excess as you go, just like painting a mountain. Now, for my dry stones, I'm using a little bit of that same black colour, some ochre and a little bit of white. I want a sort of a greyish colour with a hint of yellow in it. Take note of how marbled my paint really is. Now, I use a small roll of paint on the short blade of my knife, and I just touch in here and there where I think the stones will live in my wall. If there's a trick to this, it's don't fiddle with it too much. Just let the knife do its thing. Touch and move on. Save a little dark here and there. Painting a dry stone wall is certainly easier than building one. I've tried. It's not easy at all. Here you see, I just carry on building up the layers of stones in my wall, saving a little dark as I go. Let's work on the wall to the right of the gate as well. Notice how my composition is designed to lead your eye into the distance. My wall starts out small at the gate and grows much wider as it works towards you in the scene. Notice also how the size of the stones change as well. Small stones near the gate post and much bigger in the foreground. Again, it's the illusion of depth and distance you're trying to capture. I've gone back to my dark green colour here to press in some foliage. I think there's going to be lots of wildflowers in this area. Same again at the base of the other dry stone wall. And I know you're going to lose some of your lovely stones, but, well, it's part of the painting, I'm afraid. You have to sacrifice a little. I also think I want to add some lovely sort of wildflowers through the centre here. Again, this is a little bit of invention by me. I use my reference photograph as a reference, not an exact. And I hope that by using a little imagination, I can maybe improve on things. Now here's a little technique I've not shown you before, I don't think. Using the side of a 1-inch brush pressed into some highlight colour. Now, hold your brush flat against the canvas and just press. And voila! Instant long grass. Here you go. Something a little brighter so you can really see it more easily. Just touch the brush to the canvas. The dark green colour will take what it wants. It takes a little practice. It's very easy to overdo it at this stage, but again, try and save a little dark. It'll be very useful later on. Now, let's mix some mud. Well, not quite. Let's hope we don't mix mud. I take a sort of my dark Van Dyke brown and black mixture, and I want to just put in the indication of an area where I think maybe a tractor or two has rolled through this area. Notice how I use my filbert brush, but using sort of a nice little dipping stroke. I want to indicate that there is a dip in the ground here. My light is coming from the top right hand side of my painting, so I want to add a little more shadow to the right of these tracks. I let the paint disappear into the distance as though the tractor's gone off across his fields. For highlight, a little yellow ochre, a little dark sienna, and maybe just a hint of grubby white colour. Yeah, that'll do nicely. Once again, keep this marbled. A bit more brown, I think. Yeah, that's it, a little more dark sienna. Perfect. Now watch carefully. I hold my brush like a stick, and again, remembering the light comes from the left, I want to just add a hint more light to the left hand side of my path. I hold my brush very, very lightly. I use my brush strokes to reinforce the fact that there's some wear and tear on this path, a bit of a dip in the centre. Don't overwork it again, just let the brush do its thing. Well, I hope you're enjoying the tutorial so far, but I want to introduce you to this. And if you're not sure what this is, well, it's a Mahl stick, and this is my own design that I like to use to hook onto the edge of my canvas. It's not unique. Lots of other artists have made their own, but this particular one differs from a traditional one, which would have maybe a piece of cork on the end of a rod covered with a leather hood, and that would be used to actually lean on a canvas, which is fine when you're working on a dry canvas, but of course we're working wet in wet, and we can't actually have this touching. So I have a hook, which means that I can actually hook it over the edge of my canvas. I can then use my finger underneath just to brace it. It means that my canvas is held steady. The idea behind this is then I have somewhere to lean my hand when I'm painting. I'll try and do a little demonstration for you. Oops, you grab a brush. So if I have it nicely held in position, I can lean my brush against the side of it and run my hand down here, or even actually use my knuckles on here. The idea is it acts as a steady for your free hand, your painting hand. And you'll see me using this in the next section of the video. By the way, if you're enjoying what you're watching, don't forget, like and subscribe. Give the video a little thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. So, onwards and upwards with our painting. Here you see me using my Mahl stick. I put a pin in that top right corner that I can hook it against, just to do these diagonals. And I use it like a ruler. I just rest my brush against the edge of the stick and then just faintly work the line in to my painting. I do a couple of dry runs first and then let the bristles touch down. This is a very useful way of creating straight lines on a painting. I'll add these little post tops by hand. Gosh, I still managed to end up though painting them to the edge of my trees in the distance. I'll fix those later. You'd think I'd know better by now. I want to go back to my trees on the left hand side, and this time I'm going to use a fan brush and a little bit of extra bright highlight. My painting has taken a couple of days to complete so far, what with filming and editing taking up quite a bit of time. There's an advantage to this though. It means that adding a second layer of highlights will stick quite easily over the top of the first layer of highlights. Bob always worked wet in wet and at speed for the camera, but it doesn't mean to say you have to. In fact, I like to get down the basics of my painting first and then leave it a day or so for the paint to stiffen slightly and then come in and add those finer little sparkles. For instance, I want to add some little golden grasses to the background over here on the left. If that underpainting was still wet, these would just mix in completely. You might even notice I even crept in a little bit of a dry stone wall in the background on the left as well. Again, leave things to dry for a day. It makes adding detail so much easier. I just use the edge of my knife to drop in those little grasses. There. Now for some more detail. I mix up a very pale blue-grey colour. I even use a little bit of my black and grey. These are for some small flowers that I want to include in the midground of my painting. In here, against these shadows, there are some little oxide daisies, blue-grey in colour. They don't catch the sunlight where they are. Maybe even a few little Michaelmas daisies. Again, that little tuft of dark green colour there is perfect for a few dots and dashes. For my oxide daisies in highlight, notice I use pure white and I paint a little star shape. They can be very abstract. They don't have to be perfect detail here, just a suggestion of a petal here and there. I alternate between blue-grey ones and pure white ones, and I just drop them in the grasses where I want. To finish them off, I add a tiny drop of pure yellow to the faces of some of these little flowers, but they don't all get it, just here and there. It's a tiny detail, but it's amazing how much that stands out. Once again, I use my Mahl stick to steady my hand. Now, let's add a lot of little yellow dots to this middle of my painting. Notice how I go from very wide to very narrow, and how my painting disappears into the distance, even through the gate. I let my path and my little flowers disappear into the distance, take my eye to the background. Now, a competition. Spot the foxgloves. I just added a few more here, but there are some more elsewhere. On the tops of my gate, I want to add the suggestion of a little highlight. Again, blue-grey colours work perfectly for highlights. I use my Mahl stick and my palette knife just to push in a little bit of extra colour and detail. I didn't add the big tree on the right that shows in the reference photograph. I wanted to get my painting, well, almost complete before I added it. I wanted to see what the composition would look like without it first. I want to keep my tree just off the side of my canvas here. Notice I've thinned down some of my Van Dyke brown and black colour, and I'm using a liner brush, and I just do a faint line first. This gives me an idea of scale. All of this detail is quite faint until I'm really happy that I've made the right decision. Then I come back and gently build the tree. Now for some foliage. Well, I've got a choice of brushes here. And again, I want to be a little bit tentative with this. I don't want to overfill it. So I've decided to use my small round detail brush here. A little bit of the dark green colour we used on the tree on the left. And I'm just going to literally dab and dot in the leaves on my tree. This is a slow, gradual process, but it gives me a chance to stand back. It's not all over and done in 2 minutes. This took me about an hour, but it was an hour in which I had time to consider what I was doing. I just didn't want to overdo it. Now, with the light coming from over the right hand side corner of my painting, I go back in with a bit of medium light green and just add a few little dots of colour here and there. I then up the value a little bit, a bit more bright green colour. So in actual fact there are 3 green tones on my tree. A dark, a medium and a very bright green. Here the bright green colour goes on and it really makes my tree pop. Now I want to do something with this area too. Notice I fiddled around with the tops of my fence posts and I lifted one up a little bit higher. But I want to soften this edge slightly. Again, I want my eye to be taken into the background of my painting. I add a little ivy to the top of my dry stone wall. A few little dots of highlight to indicate the light is getting over the edge of the wall and just catching a leaf here and there. Here's a useful technique I've not shown you before. I've taken some of my blue-grey colour, a bit of green mixed in with it, and I've added into it a small amount of thinners to make a very thin wash of colour. I want to do a reflection of my gate on the ground. This is called a glaze. It's thin and transparent, and it means that you can paint it over another object which has already dried slightly without them mixing together. It's a subtle way of adding a detail without too much of a hard edge. But it's also useful in places like this. I want to darken down this little bit of foliage, but I don't want to lose the detail. Notice how my dark glaze colour just tones everything down. This is a very useful technique to learn and one that you should employ in your own paintings that get, well, a little over highlighted. And finally, a signature. Working from a photograph to create a lovely country scene. Not so hard after all, I hope. So there you have it. From a photograph to a finished painting. Now, go and dig out those photograph albums. You know the ones, those I'll paint that one day. See if you can find your own next project and apply this method. But don't move, there's another lovely painting coming right along. Happy painting, people!